In 2017, my fiancé, now my husband, and I decided to go camping in eastern Pennsylvania. The place we picked for the night was very basic. Camping was free, there was no cell service, and the road was barely passable. We did come across two other people. They might not be connected to what happened later, but they were strange enough that I'll mention them. The first person was a woman with her truck parked slightly off the road as we drove by. The hood was up, and she seemed to be waiting for someone to stop and help. Normally, my fiancé would have no problem stopping, but this time, something about her made him uneasy. She didn't look like she really needed help, and usually people who need help look hopeful when you approach. But she just seemed to expect we'd stop. At least that's what my fiancé thought. I didn't notice anything particularly odd about her. The second person appeared after we had chosen a spot and were setting up a fire for dinner. I had seen a car drive by a few times, but my fiancé pointed out that it was the same car each time, and the man inside seemed to be watching us. This made my fiancé a bit uncomfortable, but we had driven around for a while before finding a spot we liked. The ground was muddy from recent rain, and we wanted the driest spot possible. The man in the car could have been doing the same thing. We briefly considered moving, but the road was so muddy that if he wanted to find us, he could easily follow our tracks. There were some other tracks, but not many. He'd only have to backtrack a little to find us. After a while, the man didn't come by again, so we stayed and spent the remaining daylight hours relaxing. No one else drove by. Whether those two people had anything to do with what happened later, the real scare came much later. We had gone to sleep in our tent, and around 3 a.m., we were startled awake by an incredibly loud noise. I can't describe it well or even remember exactly what it sounded like, but my fiancé said it reminded him of a chain gun starting up. Another way he described it was that it sounded like someone had recorded the noise of a shovel being dragged over gravel and played it through a loudspeaker. He jumped up and looked out the small tent window but couldn't see anything. The noise happened a few more times. I was too scared to speak, so my fiancé whispered that it was probably far away, and I should go back to sleep. I didn't question it, thinking that loud noises could easily carry from miles away. After we left, he admitted that it had sounded like it was coming from just down the road, but he didn't want to scare me. Looking back, I probably should have questioned why he felt the need to whisper if the noise was supposedly far off. I was still terrified. Every small sound outside seemed like footsteps around the tent. We laid there for a while until my fiancé finally told me to get dressed because we were leaving. I became more alarmed when he unwrapped the machete we had bought for the trip before opening the tent. We quickly packed up and loaded the car. I looked around for any footprints that weren't ours, but even though the moon was bright, I couldn't see any. I did notice something my fiancé hadn't seen before we got in the car. A beer can buy our extinguished fire that hadn't been there earlier. We didn't even bring any beer. As we drove away, my fiancé explained that he was worried someone might have been trying to lure us out, so he didn't think it was safe to leave the tent right away. He also half expected our gas tank to have been siphoned, but that wouldn't have stopped us because we were driving a hybrid car. We joked about how that would make a great hybrid commercial. Number of near-miss murders avoided by driving a hybrid, 2. We only joked because we were still terrified and running on adrenaline. For the rest of our trip, we only stayed in well-populated campgrounds or opted for hotels. The woods murmured secrets, its shadows swaying with a haunting charm as I ventured further into its depths, guided solely by the faint light of the moon above. Each step resonated ominously, echoing through the thick undergrowth like a solemn beat. The air was heavy with anticipation, carrying the scent of wet earth and ancient decay. I had always been drawn to the quiet of the forest, but tonight, the usual calm felt unsettling, as if the trees themselves harbored dark intentions. Despite the unease gnawing at the edges of my awareness, I pressed on, driven by an unexplainable urge to explore the unknown. The canopy above thickened, devouring the moonlight, plunging the forest floor into a deep darkness. Branches twisted and curled like bony fingers, reaching out to trap the unwary traveler. My heart raced faster, a primal instinct warning of hidden dangers just beyond the shadows. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the silence, sending shivers down my spine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as I strained to locate the source of the noise. But the woods kept its secrets hidden, wrapping me in a stifling embrace of uncertainty. I stumbled forward, each step echoing like a loud crash in the overwhelming stillness. A sense of dread thickened the air, growing with each moment like a sinister mist settling on the land. And then I saw it. A brief movement in the darkness, as fleeting and elusive as a puff of smoke. My pulse quickened, dread settling in my gut as I realized I was not alone in the depths of the forest. Eyes gleamed in the shadows, shining with a strange hunger that sent a chill through me. I tried to run, to escape the unknown terror lurking in the darkness, but the woods seemed to conspire against me, twisting and turning like a maze with no way out. Panic gripped me, threatening to consume me as I stumbled deeper into the heart of the darkness. Time lost all meaning in the suffocating embrace of the forest, its twisted branches trapping me in a nightmare of despair. Each moment stretched into eternity, a relentless torment of fear and uncertainty that threatened to tear me apart. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground like a primal drum. My blood ran cold, terror flooding my veins as I realized the true danger that lurked in the shadows. I turned to flee, to escape the unseen horror that stalked me through the darkness. But it was too late. Something ancient and primal lunged from the depths of the woods, its eyes burning with a deep hunger that filled me with terror. I screamed, a raw cry of agony and despair that echoed through the silent night. But there was no rescue to be found in the heart of the forest. The darkness swallowed me whole, consuming me as the world faded away. And so, dear reader, take heed as you venture into the unknown. For in the heart of the forest, where shadows dance and whispers linger, there are horrors beyond imagination, waiting to claim the unwary traveler as their own. It was the middle of the night when we got the call. Our team had been stationed in a thick forest for weeks, doing regular patrols and keeping watch. It was supposed to be quiet, just another routine job. But that night, something didn't feel right. The forest was too quiet, the air too heavy. I led my team into the woods, our boots crunching on the dry leaves. The moon barely shined through the thick trees, casting long, dark shadows that made it hard to see much of anything. We moved close together, relying on our training to guide us through the dark. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest felt. The usual night sounds, crickets, leaves rustling, were gone. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I kept my rifle close, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just a heavy feeling that something was very wrong. We kept going, our footsteps the only sound. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I pushed the team forward. We had a job to do. But then, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There was an open space ahead, right in the middle of the forest where there shouldn't have been one. The trees around it were all broken, snapped like twigs, and the ground was torn up like something huge had come through here. But there was no sign of what caused it, no tracks, no clues. We circled the open space, staying back, trying to figure it out. But as we stood there, I noticed something else. There were no animal sounds here either. The forest was completely silent, like it was dead, and I could feel that dead feeling crawling into my bones. As we looked around, one of the guys pointed out something I had missed. On the far side of the clearing, half hidden by a pile of broken branches, was a small, dark hole in the ground. It looked like a cave or tunnel just big enough for a person to crawl through, but it wasn't on any of our maps. Even though I knew better, I moved closer, crouching down to get a better look. The hole was dark, and the air coming out of it was cold, colder than it should have been. I could see a faint glimmer of something deep inside, but I couldn't tell what it was. Whatever it was, it didn't belong there. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly stood up, backing away. We needed to get out of there. Whatever had torn up the clearing, whatever had made the forest so quiet, it had something to do with that hole. And I didn't want to find out what it was. We turned back, moving quickly through the forest, not even trying to stay quiet anymore. The feeling of dread that had been building up was almost choking me now. I could feel something watching us, something still out there, hidden in the shadows. When we finally reached the safety of our base, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I didn't report what we found, and neither did anyone else. We didn't talk about it, didn't even mention it to each other. But I know we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever was out there in the forest wasn't normal. It wasn't something we could fight or protect ourselves against. It was something ancient, something that didn't belong in our world. And it was still out there, waiting in the dark. That hole in the ground? It was just a doorway. And whatever came out of it, whatever was lurking in that forest, was still out there. Watching, waiting. And I knew deep down that if we ever went back, we wouldn't stand a chance. We had only caught a glimpse of the darkness hiding in those trees, and something told me that the next time, it wouldn't let us leave so easily. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a small break from the tension that had built up between my ex-wife and me. We thought a walk in the forest might help us clear our heads, maybe even find some closure. The air was cool, the kind of early autumn chill that made your skin tingle but wasn't too cold. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that moved gently with the breeze. We hadn't talked much since we left the car at the trailhead. It felt awkward, but not uncomfortable, just like things had been between us for months now. The path was narrow and a bit overgrown, but still easy enough to follow. I walked ahead, trying to focus on the trail instead of the thoughts that kept creeping into my mind. As we walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the outside world slowly faded away. All I could hear was the crunch of leaves under our feet and the occasional rustle of something moving in the bushes. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize just how alone you are. The tension grew not just between us, but in the air around us. After about an hour, we came to a small clearing. The trees opened up, letting a circle of sunlight warm the area. It seemed like a good spot to take a break, so we did. I sat down on a fallen log while she stood, looking around, maybe trying to find something to say. The silence felt heavy, like something important was about to happen, something we weren't ready for. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were ours, but they weren't. They were too big and too deep, like someone had been walking there recently, wearing heavy boots. The prints circled the clearing and disappeared into the trees on the other side. I stared at them for a moment, trying to convince myself they were old, that someone had come through before us and left them behind. But the ground was still wet, and the edges of the prints were sharp. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. We weren't alone out here. I didn't want to scare her, so I stood up and suggested we keep moving. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I knew staying in that clearing wasn't a good idea. We started walking again, this time a little faster, but the trail was harder to follow. I wasn't sure if we were still on the right path, but I didn't want to stop and check. I just wanted to get out of the forest and back to the car. The trees seemed to close in around us, the canopy growing thicker until it felt like dusk. even though it was still afternoon. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jumpy. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, just the wind, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel eyes on us, something watching, following. I glanced back and saw her eyes darting around. Wide with fear she was trying to hide. She felt it too. We picked up the pace, almost running now, but the trail was gone, swallowed up by the undergrowth. I led us in what I thought was the right direction, hoping to find the path again, but it was no use. We were lost. My heart was pounding, and I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. I didn't want to admit it, but we were in trouble. The forest was like a maze, every direction looking the same, and every tree hiding something just out of sight. Panic started to creep in, but I pushed it down, trying to stay focused. I had to get us out of there. Then I saw it. A quick flash of movement in the trees ahead. It was fast, almost too fast to see, but it was there. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. I strained my eyes, trying to see what it was, but the forest was still again. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or something, but I knew it wasn't. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. We were being followed. I didn't say anything, didn't want to make her more scared than she already was, but I could tell she knew. We started moving again, faster this time, practically running. I kept looking back, expecting to see something behind us, but there was nothing, just the trees and the shadows, closing in around us like a trap. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they'd give out. The forest seemed endless, every turn taking us deeper into its grip. And then, just when I thought we couldn't go any further, we stumbled onto the trail. It was right there, like it had been waiting for us. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a new sense of dread. The footprints were back, fresh, deep, and leading in the same direction we were going. We didn't have a choice. We had to keep going. The sun was getting low, and the last thing I wanted was to be out there after dark. We followed the trail, the footprints always just ahead of us, like someone was leading us on. I didn't know where we were going, but I knew we couldn't stop. Not now. The trees began to thin, and I could see the faint outline of the parking lot through the branches. We were almost there, almost safe, but the footprints didn't stop. They continued past the trailhead, past our car, and into the darkness beyond. Someone had been waiting for us, someone who knew we were there. We reached the car, and I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking. I didn't look back, didn't want to see what might be standing in the trees behind us. As soon as the doors were unlocked, we jumped in, slamming them shut. I started the engine and floored it, gravel spraying as we sped out of the parking lot. As we drove down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing us. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the fading light of day. We didn't speak on the drive back, the tension in the car thick and heavy. When we finally reached her place, she got out without a word, and I drove away, the fear still clinging to me like a cold, wet blanket. I haven't been back to that forest since. I don't think I ever will. Some things are better left behind, buried where they belong. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I think about those footprints, about what might have been out there with us. And I realize I'll never really know. But what scares me the most is that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't following us. Maybe it was leading us somewhere, somewhere we were never supposed to leave. I live in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by thick woods. It's the kind of place where you know everyone, and not much ever happens. The forest has always felt comforting to me, but lately, something has changed. A new neighbor moved in a few months ago. He mostly stayed to himself, never came out much, and no one really knew anything about him. His house sat right on the edge of the woods, almost hidden by the trees. It seemed like the perfect spot if you didn't want anyone to bother you. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk through the woods. I've done it a million times, but this time felt different. The air felt heavy, and the forest was way too quiet. I told myself I was just being paranoid and kept walking. Eventually, I ended up near the edge of my neighbor's yard, where the trees started to thin out. That's when I saw his house in the distance. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The ground was covered with footprints. They weren't normal footprints, though. They were deep, like someone was carrying something really heavy. The trail led from the forest straight to the back of his house. My curiosity got the better of me, so I followed the footprints. They led me to a small clearing behind his house. That's when I saw it. A large, fresh pile of dirt. It looked like a grave. My heart started racing as I realized what I was looking at. I took a few steps back, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The footprints, the pile of dirt, it all pointed to something bad. I wanted to turn around and act like I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't. I turned and hurried back the way I came, trying to stay calm, but my mind was spinning. What if he saw me? What if he knew I had figured something out? I made it back to my house and locked the door behind me, breathing hard. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept imagining my neighbor standing outside, watching my house. I started to realize how little anyone knew about him. He could be anyone, a criminal, a killer, or worse. Over the next few days, I noticed more strange things. My neighbor started coming out of his house more, but he always seemed to be watching me. Every time I left the house, he was there, just standing and staring. Felt like he was sending me a message. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The thought of what might be buried in that pile of dirt wouldn't leave my mind. I had to do something, but I was scared. What if he found out I was onto him? What if I was next? One night, I decided to face my fear. I grabbed a flashlight and headed back into the woods. It was dark, and the forest was creepily quiet. I made my way to the clearing, and there it was, the mound still untouched. As I stood there, I felt like someone was watching me. I slowly turned around, and there he was, standing at the edge of the trees. My neighbor. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me with those cold, empty eyes. I froze. My mind raced with thoughts of what he might do, but he didn't move. It felt like he was waiting for something or daring me to do something. Without thinking, I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back at my house. I locked every door and window, trying to calm down. My heart was pounding, and my mind was screaming at me to leave, to get out of the neighborhood and never look back. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't tell anyone why, just that I needed to move. As I drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the forest, wondering what was really buried there, and who my neighbor really was. I never went back. But even now, miles away in a new city, I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching me, waiting for the day I let my guard down and he can finally catch up to me. The memory of his cold, empty stare haunts my dreams, and I know that as long as he's out there, I'll never be safe. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up with the feeling that someone's in my room. I sit up, heart pounding, but no one's there. But I know it's just a matter of time before he finds me. The truth is, no matter how far I run, I can't escape him. And one day, when I least expect it, I'll wake up to see those cold eyes staring back at me from the darkness, and I'll know that he's finally come for me. I was hiking alone in the forest, hoping to find a quiet spot where I could take some photos of the untouched scenery. The day had started off bright and sunny, But as I went deeper, the trees got denser and the light started to fade. I followed a narrow path with my camera hanging from my neck, listening to the crunch of leaves under my feet. As I went further, it felt like the forest was closing in on me. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I stopped to take a photo of a huge oak tree, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Out of nowhere, I heard a soft but clear sound of twigs snapping behind me. I spun around, but the forest was empty. I tried to calm myself, thinking it was just an animal. Still, every now and then, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of my eye, but when I looked, there was nothing. As dusk began to set in, I realized I was no longer on the trail I started with. The trees looked unfamiliar, their shapes distorted by the fading light. I took out my map and compass, but the forest seemed the same in every direction. My phone had no signal, and my attempts to call for help went unanswered. Fear started to take over. I tried to retrace my steps, but every turn seemed to pull me deeper into the forest. What was once a welcoming place now felt like a maze, and the growing darkness made everything seem even more frightening. I could hear strange sounds that didn't belong, like something or someone moving just out of sight. I pushed through the dense underbrush until I came across a small clearing. In the middle was a makeshift fire pit with some old, burnt logs. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but I wasn't alone. A cold shiver ran down my spine when I saw something odd. A set of footprints leading away from the pit, and they were too big to be mine. They looked fresh. Panic surged through me, and I bolted through the darkening forest, branches tearing at my clothes. I could hear something or someone moving behind me, getting closer. My heart raced as I burst through the trees and saw the edge of the forest ahead. I stumbled onto a small road and waved frantically at a passing car. The driver pulled over, and I climbed in, shaking and out of breath. I told the driver what happened. He, a local ranger, listened and then mentioned that someone had been reported missing in the area recently. A person who had been gone for days. Later, I learned that there had been signs of someone living out there, but they never figured out who it was. The forest remained a place of mystery and danger. It turned out that the fresh footprints I had seen led to a hidden spot where a person had been hiding, possibly watching me the whole time. I never went back to those woods. The thought of what might still be lurking there, waiting in the shadows, was enough to keep me away forever. The forest was no longer a peaceful place for me. It was a haunting reminder of the unknown dangers that could be hiding just out of sight. I've always loved hiking in the forest. It was my way of getting away from everything, a place where I could clear my head and enjoy some peace. The forest felt like a second home to me, with its tall trees, the soft sound of leaves moving in the wind, and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. But this time, something felt different. I decided to try a new path, one I hadn't walked before. It was early morning, and the sun had just started to rise. The air was cool, the sky a light shade of blue, and everything seemed perfect. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees started to get closer together, and I noticed the birds had stopped singing. The path, which had started out wide and clear, began to narrow and become harder to follow. The silence started to stand out after a while. There was no wind, no sound of animals, not even the distant noise of a plane. Just a heavy, pressing quiet. I kept walking, telling myself it was just because I was far from any roads or people. But as I went on, I started to feel uneasy. The path was barely visible now, more like a thin line of trampled grass than a trail. I pulled out my phone to check for a signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no connection. I wasn't too worried, though. I was sure I could find my way back when I decided to head home. After what felt like another hour of walking, I came across a small open space. In the middle was an old, rusty car. It was strange seeing it out here miles away from any road. The car looked like it had been there for years, with weeds growing through the broken windows and moss covering the hood. The tires were flat, and the paint was peeling away in strips. I walked around the car, noticing the ground was disturbed around it, like someone had been there recently. But there were no footprints, no signs of anyone nearby. The air felt heavy, almost like it was hard to breathe, and I suddenly felt the need to leave. I decided it was time to head back. But as I tried to retrace my steps, nothing looked familiar. The trees all looked the same, and the path I thought I had been following seemed to have disappeared completely. I kept walking, trying to find anything that I recognized, but everything looked different in this part of the forest. As the hours passed, I started to panic. I was completely lost. The sky was beginning to darken, and I knew I didn't have much daylight left. I kept moving, hoping I'd eventually come across something that would guide me back. That's when I found it, another open space much like the first. But instead of a car, there was a small, run-down cabin. It was almost hidden by the trees, the wood dark and rotting. The door was slightly open, and a faint, rotten smell was coming from inside. I knew I should keep walking, but I was so tired and desperate. I needed to rest, even if it was just for a moment. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. The cabin was empty, except for a few broken pieces of furniture and a thick layer of dust. But something felt off. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Yet there were fresh footprints in the dust. I backed out of the cabin, my heart pounding. The forest felt different now, more threatening, more dangerous. I started to walk quickly, almost running, as the last light of day began to fade. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I had to keep moving. Then I heard it, a sound I hadn't heard all day, a branch snapping behind me. I froze and listened, holding my breath. The silence returned, even deeper than before. I told myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I started running, not caring which direction I was going. I just needed to get away from whatever was out there. The trees blurred past me as I ran, my breath coming in short gasps. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Finally, I saw a tree I recognized, one with a strange, twisted trunk that I had noticed on my way in. Relief washed over me as I realized I had somehow found my way back to the main trail. I kept running, not stopping until I reached the edge of the forest, where my car was parked. I didn't look back as I drove away, the image of that cabin and the feeling of being watched still fresh in my mind. I haven't gone back to that forest since. The place that once felt like a safe escape now felt like a trap, a place where things weren't what they seemed. A few days after that hike, I couldn't shake the feeling, so I did a bit of digging. I found out that several people had gone missing in that forest over the years. The strange part? Many of them were last seen heading down the same trail I had taken. None of them were ever found. And every night since then, when I close my eyes, I see the outline of that cabin and feel that same heavy silence. It's like it's calling me back, daring me to return. But I know if I do, I won't come back out.